On July 15, 1099, the walls of Jerusalem finally broke. For weeks, the Crusader army had surrounded the holy city under a scorching Middle Eastern sun, starving, praying, and preparing for what they believed was God's will. When their siege towers crashed against the defenses and soldiers poured through the breaches, restraint vanished. Chroniclers like Raymond of Aguilars wrote that the streets ran slick with blood, that bodies filled alleyways from the Temple Mount to the city gates. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were cut down in a frenzy of religious fury, while Crusader knights raised crosses above the conquered skyline. To them, this was not slaughter, it was salvation. They believed they had reclaimed Christ's sacred city after centuries of Islamic rule. But this moment of brutal triumph was not born in Jerusalem. It began 4 years earlier, in 1095, when a pope standing in a French field ignited Europe with a promise: fight for the Holy Land, and your sins would be erased. What followed would build a kingdom forged not just in faith, but in blood. In November 1095, in the small French town of Clermont, Pope Urban II stood before a vast crowd of nobles, knights, and clergy and delivered a speech that would change the course of history. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had appealed to Western Europe for military aid against the advancing Seljuk Turks, who had taken much of Anatolia after their victory at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. But Urban's response went far beyond a simple call for assistance. He framed the conflict as a sacred duty. Jerusalem, the city of Christ, was under Muslim control. Eastern Christians, he declared, were suffering. Whoever took up arms to liberate the Holy Land would receive remission of sins, an extraordinary spiritual reward in a deeply religious age. The response was explosive. Cries of "Deus vult!" God wills it! Echoed through the crowd. What followed was not a disciplined royal campaign but a mass movement. Thousands sewed crosses onto their tunics and cloaks, transforming from feudal warriors into self-proclaimed soldiers of God. Knights burdened by debt saw opportunity. Landless younger sons saw hope for wealth and territory. Peasants saw a chance at salvation. Even entire families prepared for the journey east. In 1096, waves of crusaders began marching toward Constantinople, many poorly equipped and driven more by zeal than strategy. The first to move was the so-called People's Crusade, led by the charismatic preacher Peter the Hermit. Lacking discipline and supplies, these crowds unleashed violence even before reaching the Holy Land. Jewish communities in the Rhineland cities of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz suffered massacres at the hands of crusading mobs who justified their brutality as purifying Christendom before confronting Islam. It was an ominous sign of what faith fused with fanaticism could produce. When the main armies of nobles and seasoned knights arrived in Constantinople, tensions quickly surfaced. Emperor Alexios demanded oaths of loyalty and the return of former Byzantine lands. Many Crusader leaders agreed reluctantly, seeing the Byzantines as suspicious allies rather than brothers in faith. Yet they needed Byzantine ships and guidance to cross into Anatolia. What had begun as a spiritual call was rapidly becoming a military expedition, one fueled by ambition, distrust, and a growing appetite for conquest. In 1097, the true military campaign began as organized Crusader armies crossed from Constantinople into Anatolia, stepping into lands hardened by decades of Seljuk expansion. Their first major test came at Nicaea, a fortified city once held by the Byzantines. After a difficult siege, the city surrendered not to the Crusaders directly, but to Emperor Alexios' forces, who negotiated secretly to prevent it from being sacked. Many Crusader leaders felt cheated of plunder, and mistrust toward Byzantium deepened. Still, the march continued inland, where the Seljuk Turks relied on mobility and horse archery to harass the heavily armored European knights. At the Battle of Dorylaeum in July 1097, the Crusaders narrowly avoided disaster, regrouping just in time to repel a mounted assault through disciplined infantry lines and devastating cavalry charges. The deeper they advanced, the harsher the land became. Anatolia's dry plains brought thirst, starvation, and disease. Horses collapsed. Supplies ran thin. Yet momentum drove them forward, bound by oath and belief. By October 1097, they reached Antioch, one of the greatest fortified cities in the region. Its massive walls and towers loomed as a near-impossible obstacle. The siege dragged on for months. Food shortages grew so severe that some soldiers reportedly resorted to eating their own animals and, according to hostile sources, even cannibalism. Morale fractured. Desertions increased. In June 1098, after nearly 8 months, a breakthrough came, not through brute force, but betrayal. A guard inside Antioch secretly opened a gate to the Crusaders. They flooded the city under cover of darkness, slaughtering defenders and claiming victory. But triumph turned quickly to terror. A massive Muslim relief army under Kerboga of Mosul surrounded the city, trapping the Crusaders inside the very walls they had just taken. Starving and outnumbered, the Crusader leaders rallied their forces with claims of divine visions and holy relics, including the supposed discovery of the Holy Lance. Whether miracle or morale tactic, it worked. In a desperate sortie, they charged out and defeated Kerboga's army against the odds. Antioch became the first major Crusader stronghold in the east. Yet it also revealed a dangerous truth: survival depended not only on faith, but on siegecraft, betrayal, and relentless violence. Jerusalem was still hundreds of miles away, but the pattern of conquest had been set. In July 1099, after a grueling march south along the Mediterranean coast, the Crusader army finally stood before Jerusalem. The city had changed hands from Seljuk to Fatimid control just a year earlier, and its Egyptian governor had fortified the defenses, poisoning wells and preparing for siege. The Crusaders, exhausted and reduced in number from years of attrition, faced towering walls with limited supplies and almost no water. Yet retreat was unthinkable. For many, this was the endpoint of a sacred vow made 4 years earlier in France. They fasted, prayed barefoot around the city's perimeter, and prepared for one final assault. The initial attacks failed. Ladders splintered under defensive fire. Archers on the walls rained arrows down upon them. Realizing brute force alone would not succeed, the Crusaders dismantled nearby timber and constructed massive siege towers and battering rams. On July 14, they launched a coordinated assault. One tower, led by Godfrey of Bouillon, was maneuvered close enough to the northern wall for a bridge to be dropped onto the battlements. By the morning of July 15, Crusader knights had breached the defenses. Once inside, discipline dissolved into fury. Contemporary chronicles described scenes of extraordinary violence. Muslim defenders were cut down in the streets and in the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Jewish residents who sought refuge in synagogues were not spared. Numbers vary widely in historical estimates, but the massacre left thousands dead. For the victors, this was framed as divine justice. For the city's inhabitants, it was catastrophe. The Crusaders seized control of the sacred sites, raising banners and kneeling in prayer at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In the aftermath, leadership of the conquered city became the next challenge. Godfrey refused the title of king in the place where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, instead adopting the title advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was born. Alongside other Crusader states carved from conquered territories, Edessa, Antioch, and later Tripoli. Fortified castles soon rose across the Levant, anchoring Latin Christian rule in hostile lands. An empire had been established not through gradual settlement, but through siege, slaughter, and unyielding conviction. Yet the bloodshed that secured Jerusalem also guaranteed that retaliation would come. By the mid-12th century, the Crusader states that had once surged forward with unstoppable momentum were increasingly divided, vulnerable, and surrounded by resurgent Muslim powers. Out of this fractured political landscape rose a leader who would alter the balance of power entirely, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. Born in 1137 or 1138 in Tikrit, he was not initially a king, but a soldier serving under his uncle Shirkuh. Through calculated loyalty and political maneuvering, Saladin rose within the Zengid dynasty and was eventually appointed vizier of Egypt in 1169. When the Fatimid Caliphate collapsed in 1171, Saladin abolished it, restoring Sunni authority and laying the foundation for his own Ayyubid dynasty. Over the next decade, he methodically unified Egypt and much of Syria under his command, something no Muslim ruler had achieved since the arrival of the Crusaders. Unlike the fragmented Crusader lords, Saladin centralized power, strengthened finances, and built a disciplined military force. He avoided reckless confrontation, instead isolating Crusader territories through strategic diplomacy and limited warfare. When internal disputes weakened the Kingdom of Jerusalem, particularly under the unstable rule of King Guy of Lusignan, Saladin saw his opportunity. In 1187, tensions escalated after the Crusader Lord Reynaud of Châtillon attacked Muslim caravans in violation of existing truces. Saladin responded decisively. He assembled a massive army and lured the Crusader forces into the arid plains near the Horns of Hattin. On July 4, 1187, under the relentless summer sun, the Crusader army found itself trapped without water. Saladin's forces encircled them, setting fire to dry brush to choke and disorient the enemy. Exhausted, dehydrated, and surrounded, the Crusader knights were overwhelmed. The true cross relic they carried was captured. Reynaud was executed personally by Saladin, while King Guy was spared. With the Crusader field army destroyed, city after city fell with little resistance. By October 1187, Saladin stood before Jerusalem. After brief negotiations and limited resistance, the city surrendered. Unlike the massacre of 1099, Saladin permitted many inhabitants to ransom themselves and avoided large-scale slaughter. In less than a year, the Crusader empire built in blood had been broken by discipline, unity, and calculated vengeance. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 sent shockwaves across Europe. Churches told in mourning, and monarchs who had once ignored the distant Crusader states now faced a humiliating reality: the Holy City was lost. In response, the Third Crusade was launched, drawing some of the most powerful rulers of the age into direct confrontation with Saladin. Among them was King Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, a warrior king whose reputation for courage and ferocity matched the scale of the crisis. Alongside him marched Philip II of France and the aging Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, though Barbarossa would drown en route in 1190. Fracturing German participation before reaching the battlefield. Richard arrived in the Levant in 1191 and immediately demonstrated military precision during the Siege of Acre. After months of brutal fighting, the city fell to Crusader forces. Yet victory was stained with blood. When negotiations over prisoner exchanges collapsed, Richard ordered the execution of thousands of Muslim captives outside the city walls, a ruthless act meant to pressure Saladin and demonstrate resolve. The war that followed was defined not by chaotic fanaticism, but by tactical brilliance on both sides. At the Battle of Arsuf in September 1191, Saladin's cavalry repeatedly harassed Richard's marching army, seeking to provoke disorder. But Richard maintained tight formation discipline among his infantry and crossbowmen, waiting for the precise moment to unleash a devastating cavalry counterattack. The charge broke Saladin's lines and secured a Crusader victory, re-establishing coastal control. Yet despite battlefield success, Jerusalem remained beyond reach. Richard understood that even if he captured the city, holding it without secure supply lines would be nearly impossible. The conflict evolved into a strategic stalemate, marked by skirmishes, negotiations, and mutual respect between two formidable commanders. In 1192, Richard and Saladin agreed to a truce. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would be granted safe access to holy sites. The Crusader kingdom survived, reduced but not extinguished. The empire forged in 1099 endured, but no longer as an unstoppable force. It existed now in fragile balance, sustained by coastal strongholds and dependent on distant European support. The dream of permanent dominion over Jerusalem had faded into uneasy compromise. After the truce of 1192, the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem survived in name, but its foundations were increasingly unstable. Power struggles among noble families weakened internal unity, while European monarchs grew distracted by conflicts closer to home. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, never even reached the Holy Land. Instead, diverted by political and financial entanglements with Venice, Crusader forces sacked Constantinople in 1204, the capital of Christian Byzantium. The destruction of the greatest Christian city in the East shattered any remaining trust between Eastern and Western Christendom and permanently weakened a crucial buffer state. Rather than strengthening the Crusader position, it fractured alliances and deepened regional instability. Meanwhile, Muslim leadership evolved. In Egypt and Syria, the Ayyubid dynasty eventually gave way to the Mamluks, elite slave soldiers who seized power in 1250. Hardened, disciplined, and highly militarized, the Mamluks proved far more aggressive in confronting the remaining Crusader enclaves. Under leaders such as Sultan Baybars, they launched systematic campaigns to dismantle Crusader strongholds one by one. Coastal fortresses that had once symbolized Latin dominance, fortified castles like Croc de Chevaliers, fell after relentless sieges. The Mongol invasions of the mid-13th century briefly altered the regional balance, but the Mamluks halted Mongol expansion at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, preserving their dominance in the Levant. With both Mongol and Crusader threats contained, the Mamluks focused on eliminating the last remnants of Latin rule. European reinforcements dwindled, and enthusiasm for costly eastern expeditions declined. Trade interests increasingly replaced crusading fervor. By 1291, the Crusader presence had shrunk to a narrow strip of coastal cities. Acre, the final major stronghold, became the last stand. Mamluk forces encircled the city in a massive siege. Despite desperate resistance from Knights Templar and Hospitaller defenders, the walls were breached. Street fighting raged before Acre finally fell in May 1291. Survivors fled by ship to Cyprus, abandoning 2 centuries of Crusader ambition. The empire born in the blood of Jerusalem in 1099 ended not with a single cataclysmic battle, but with erosion, through division, miscalculation, and the steady rise of stronger, more unified enemies. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem had vanished from the mainland forever. For nearly 2 centuries, from 1099 to 1291, the Crusader states stood as a violent experiment in faith-driven empire. They were forged in massacre, sustained by fortified castles, and defended by generations who believed they were fighting for eternal salvation. Yet their legacy cannot be measured only in battles won or cities lost. The Crusades reshaped trade between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, accelerating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technology. Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa grew wealthy transporting armies and supplies. Contact with the Islamic world exposed Europeans to advanced knowledge in medicine, mathematics, and philosophy, influences that would later ripple into the Renaissance. At the same time, the human cost was immense. Tens of thousands, perhaps far more across successive crusades, died in wars fueled by religious conviction and political ambition. Relations between Christians, Muslims, and Jews were scarred by cycles of massacre and retaliation that echoed for centuries. The Kingdom of Jerusalem ultimately fell, but the memory of its rise and collapse endured in both Western and Middle Eastern consciousness. When belief becomes a banner for conquest, the line between devotion and destruction can disappear, and history remembers both.